Welcome, everyone. My name is David Wood and I chair London Futurists. One of the best pieces of advice in life may be the following. It's a quote from the German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Things which matter most must never be at the mercy of things which matter least. But how do we know what matters most and whether we're making any progress in that direction? How do we know whether we're being distracted by things that might appear attractive or fun or valuable, but which we may come to regret later in life for pulling us in a direction we have come to dislike? One thing we all do is to pay attention to measurements. How many people have visited our website? How many likes did our latest social media post receive? How much income are we making? And is our government making the GDP go up or go down? Unfortunately, rather than measuring what we truly value, it seems we often end up with things the other way around. We value what gets measured, and measurements take on a life of their own. That's the case with the central topic of today's webinar, GDP. We'll be hearing from Richard Hayes, Deputy Chief Economist at the UK's Office of National Statistics. Richard has given a great deal of attention to the desirability and possibility of us all moving beyond GDP, so that our lives and our political decisions are less influenced by a measurement that, as we'll hear, has many drawbacks. Richard, welcome to London Futurist. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to all of you who are giving up your Saturday afternoon, Saturday morning, wherever you may be, to listen to this. I'm just going to quickly draw attention to the caveat at the bottom. The research findings developed by myself and a wider team. I'm going to very quickly do some credits in just a moment. But they are not necessarily the views of the ONS. That's just a sort of general caveat we apply on many of these types of things. So just before we get started, this talk really covers two perspectives, a systems perspective, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that first, which I've been participating through a network, the UN Network of Economic Statisticians, to develop. And so thanks to Ivo from the UN, Greg and Daniela from Canada, Benson from the UN, Jan from the Netherlands, Kiana from the UK, and Eric from the American Bureau of Economic Analysis. The second half of the presentation is an ONS team. We have been working for a while looking at our potential to develop metrics beyond GDP. I'll talk about those in a while in the second half of the talk, and in the sort of bridge but from one to the other, I'll flag why some of that is relatively contentious and is provoking conversation. But let's get started with the need to go beyond GDP. Now, many of you will probably recognize Robert Kennedy. Some of you may have heard of the infamous quote from a heckler in a panel at a panel discussion during the EU referendum, when one of the talkers was referring to GDP and the potential impacts on GDP from different decisions falling out of that referendum. And they both say something which I think is fundamentally important about people's perspectives on GDP. But I'm going to draw you first to Simon Kuznets, who it was one of the progenitors, one of the creators of GDP and the national accounts. And one of the great oddities of GDP is, even before it was created, even before it was sort of formalized and recognized internationally, even its creators were signposting the dangers of misuse. I mean, this really is like Ford standing up and in his first sales pitch explaining that you use a car for driving, don't attempt to use it for scuba diving. It was very much sort of front and center in people's minds that what they were attempting to describe, what they were trying to produce, was an economic measure, a measure which allowed you to understand the level of economic activity in the economy, but not more widely. I think, often, one of the things you don't often hear economists say is that there's a recognized need for economists to be humble in what we can achieve and what we can't achieve. But Kuznets very much, and many of his peers, were very minded that what they were describing was an economic perspective on the world of work and the world of production. It wasn't a wider narrative about the welfare of a nation. How GDP therefore ended up being in that position, being used often as a proxy for that, is something I'm going to touch on in a moment. But this has been a debate that has been going on almost ever since. And in 2010, the Stiglitz, Sen, and Futurists review again brought out very clearly that if we measure the wrong things, then we will worry about the wrong things. This debate, as I say, has remained live and active for a sustained period of time. And so the question of how to make progress, I think, is very much at the moment front and center of, again, many people's minds as we see the relationship between material well-being, material wealth, material production, and wider concepts of well-being increasingly being questioned and considered. Before we go on to what's wrong with GDP, we need to have a short discussion about the current landscape, because following Stiglitz, Sen, and Futurists, there was a large and extensive program of work undertaken by lots of different international organizations to try and fill the gaps that report identified. And that report identified that the world is a far more complex place than GDP or a single measure of activity reveals. It was a world where there were trade-offs between key components and metrics, and particularly if we think about the big challenges in society today, if you refer to the 5 megatrends that the UN sometimes describe around climate change, aging population, urbanization, digitalization, and globalization of activity, many of those megatrends have an impact on GDP, but they equally have impacts on wider aspects of our world and our society. And classically, I think we now have reached a position where we often think about a trade-off in 3 dimensions between the economy, the environment, and society. Now, a measure of the economy obviously gives you a perspective on that landscape, but it doesn't give you a complete perspective, and that's what I'm going to cover in just a second. But what's equally important is that if you want to be thinking about that landscape and you want to be understanding how to conceptualize that landscape and how to produce data which gives you a joined up narrative across those 3 domains of economy, environment, and society, then one needs to have a statistical framework which gives you access into those spaces and that treats data from the 3 domains as of equal importance. Now, this is a direction that the international statistical community has been moving in over a number of years. So in the world of statistics, there are these 3 broad domains, and there are guidance which is applied internationally or shared internationally, which gives best practice for national statistics in institutes like the ONS globally. to measure things on a consistent basis so that we can compare one country with another. At the heart of this endeavor is the need for us to not just have metrics which help domestic policymakers think about issues within one country, but very often they're also trying to think about how they compare their country with others of a similar type, of a similar nature, of a similar level of development. And that international comparability is at the heart of making that happen in a statistical space. Now, the system of national accounts that I'm going to talk about in a moment, which is the guiding document around how we measure the economy, was first developed in 1948, is well established and has deep roots. It has now a parallel which was accepted a few years ago at the UN Statistics Commission for widespread use around the environment, the system of environmental and economic accounts, which gives us a perspective on the ecosystems and the aspects of the environment, stocks and flows, which are vital for human life and wider life on the planet. But the third corner, the sort of third part of this triangle around population, demographics, and wider issues in and around society, which can be very wide-ranging and stretch all the way from governance, measures of democracy, freedom, those types of things, through to measures of education and distributions of inequality, is a bit more of an open field where multiple organizations have for very many years been developing components of the system, but maybe not the whole of the system in one place. And very much this is partly a story of how these systems came into being. So in the world of economics, the system of national accounts as a sort of apex of the pyramid was drawn first in 1948, and subsequent detailed guidance in all sorts of areas on how to measure prices, on how to classify industries, followed. In the world of social statistics, those disaggregated components came first, with bodies as varied from the World Health Organization, UNESCO, UNICEF developing their components, but without the apex on the pyramid to explain how all of those needed to fit together. And so you do get areas where one set of statistics might break populations of children down by one set of age categories, and a different set of statistics will use a different set of age categories, that they aren't directly comparable. And so in work that we've been doing at the UN Network of Economic Statisticians, we've been encouraging the community to look again at this landscape and this need for this apex document, which then provides you with the three pillars covered in equal terms, which then allows you to pull together a central framework of sustainable and inclusive well-being. And the aim here is to draw data which exists from the three other frameworks, the system of national accounts, the system of environmental and economic accounts, and a system of population statistics or accounts, to give you a firm basis on which we can all use data in a more joined up and more consistent way. Because at the moment, I think we as a community see that there are effectively three problems. The first problem is that if everyone is doing good work, this can be very confusing for users to identify which metric they should be using. So it may be that you want to consider the wealth of a nation. I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. Now, you could turn to the World Bank and look at their measures of comprehensive wealth. You could turn to the country's national accounts and look at their balance sheet. Or you could turn to the UN environmental programs measures of inclusive wealth, all of which give different numbers because different assumptions and different prioritizations have been given within the work. But quite which is the best metric for you and your purpose, your policy question, isn't always clear. And so we view that the central framework has a key function to service, which is to better signpost for users of this suite of products which were developed post Stiglitz-Sen and Fitoussi, and explain which is optimal for which purpose. In parallel to this, many countries have, on the back of this work, and on the back of the development of UN Sustainable Development Goals, developed their own dashboards, their own well-being dashboards. And for those of you in the UK who are interested in this, the UK is currently consulting on its well-being dashboard and the metrics which are included there. That consultation is available via the ONS website. If you put in National Wellbeing Framework Consultation into Google, I'm sure you will find it. But many countries publish slightly different dashboards with slightly different components. And again, for those countries which are at the point of wanting to develop these, a document which captures the variety of data items which are used in such dashboards and identifies which are most commonly used. So if you wish to be comparable, you can do that. That looks to us to be another key aspect of the requirement of a central framework. Thirdly, the system of national accounts is currently undergoing revision, which is one of the reasons that there's such an active field of discussion about this at the moment. And one of the things that the system of national accounts in its latest iteration is going to re-articulate is that GDP shouldn't be seen as a measure of well-being. The national accounts aren't a system of measurement of well-being, but they do produce individual data components, areas of data which can be viewed as contributors to well-being. And so the system of national accounts very much in sort of is trying to achieve the partnership with the central framework by saying, here are the components that we think are parts of well-being and which you can marry up with other data from the environmental side, from the social side, to give you a more complete picture. But it isn't necessarily the role of the SNA to attempt to deliver all those components. And the final thing we want the framework to do, which is going to be proposed to the UN Statistical Commission in March next year to begin development, and that will be it won't be a rapid process of development. These things do take time. There's a lot of consultation which will need to occur. The final thing we want that to do is to look at where there are gaps, where people, despite the great efforts which have been made, where we haven't necessarily achieved all of the data outputs across the international system that people may desire, and therefore key questions around how we would go on to develop these. Now, I mentioned at the very start of my talk that one of the questions is around what's called composite indicators, or how a metric like GDP, which is drawn together from lots and lots of different components, the validity of this. Now, it is worth saying that if one stands back and attempts to write a central framework of sustainable and inclusive well-being, if one got that right, if one captured all of the key contributory factors towards well-being and their measures, one hasn't achieved a measurement system. One has effectively identified the recipe for human happiness. If you can get an adequate understanding of the key drivers of well-being and their relative importance against each other, such that you could bring these all in a properly weighted way into a single number, that philosophically has been, what mankind has been searching for about 3,000 years. And therefore, we have a fundamental doubt whether any measurement system is ever going to be able to attain that. Essentially, if one thinks about well-being and the key drivers of even if we consider that well-being is a constant across humanity and across the world, the drivers of well-being could well change by time, by place, by culture. And so, thinking about how you pull these together becomes an extremely scary challenge. But there is a need to think about how far we can stretch in that direction because of the particular nature of GDP. And when you have a strong competitor on the pitch, you do need to think about how are you going to overcome them. And so that's very much where we're going to start off now, with this question of what's so wrong and what's so right about GDP. Now, I'm going to take us on a little discursive again around where GDP came from. But I'm going to come back to that question of how we produce a composite metric better takes into account more components, even if it can't ever attain all the components of well-being. But ultimately, now I'm hoping that many of you will have some idea about what GDP is, but effectively, GDP is a flow metric. It's a measure of all the goods and services produced, purchased, or from which we earn income across an economy in a period of time, normally a year. And the system of national accounts describes both the flows like GDP, so the flow of benefits that we receive, and stocks, things like our holdings of capital of various types. So this might be machines, buildings, software in a more intangible world. And so the question of how GDP became so dominant even within this system, when you have stocks and flows together, is effectively a question of where it came from. And its birthplace was the UN conventions which gathered in London between 1945 and 1948. And if you think about London in the run-up to 1948, you can very much think about a world. That photo is that is a colour photo, amazingly, of London at that time. This is a city that very much really only flows mattered, because in a world of thinking about capitals, there really wasn't the capital available to drive welfare that you might see in the modern world. And therefore, if you couldn't produce goods and services, you weren't going to get any benefit from them. And those were going to be your primary drivers of your well-being. I mean, if we think about natural capital in London in 1948, thinking about the River Thames there, by 1957, the Thames had been declared biologically dead. Fish did not swim in the river in 1948 in any great numbers, at least beyond sort of the industrial heart of London. In terms of smog, the fog there, the mist in that picture, pollution caused by generally the burning of coal and other such products led to the Great Smog of 1952, which led to legislation, effectively because people were dying walking around the streets of London, often because vehicles couldn't see them. The housing stock, equally, if you think about produced capitals, over 250,000 houses in London have been destroyed during the Second World War. If you watch films of the period, you will generally see houses broken up into multiple occupation, with people having different rooms. Films like the Lavender Hill Mob, for example. Over 300 factories were destroyed in individual London boroughs. And if one thinks about human capital, only around 3.5% of young people went to university. Now, if you compare that to 2017 in the UK, the more recent number was more like 42%. It's sort of a factor of 10 or more larger. And so if there isn't very much capital in the stocks, it's not a surprise that the world, when they initially designed the system, were thinking very much more about the flows. But if we fast forward to the right-hand side of this picture, this is some data that we released a couple of weeks ago. One can see that if one includes natural and human capital into your picture of net worth of the country, a sort of inclusive measure of net worth which sweeps up these components, the relative scale of these things is very, very stark. Out of a total of 36 trillion, and it's worth saying that that 36 trillion number is about 15 times larger than GDP. Only about 10, 11 trillion are what we might call the traditional produced and non-produced capital stocks, which one sees in the national accounts. Things like the value of land, the value of buildings, the value of machines, the value of intangible assets like R&D and software. Less than 2 trillion is natural capital. This is the value of ecosystems like fishing, peatland, areas of low-lying land that act and gives flood protection by absorbing floodwaters. But the obvious number in the bottom right-hand corner in the large red circle there, the 23.7 trillion pounds, which is very much the key driver of that wider picture, is the human capital stock. So this is the acquisition of skills and knowledge through training and qualifications that we can each use to access higher earnings, to be more productive, and which we can take from employer to employer, and which drives up our well-being. Now, clearly, a system which focuses, which it currently excludes both the natural capital and particularly the human capital, when we think just about the traditional model of the national accounts, which always excluded these items. So the blue circle is what you will find in the national accounts, is very much an attempt to describe the national economy. It's akin to attempting to describe the Himalaya. If you attempt to describe the economy excluding human capital, it's effectively like attempting to describe the Himalayas whilst not mentioning the mountains. Everything about the topography, the shape, the distribution of assets, and wider features of the economy fundamentally relate back to this number, but the national accounts don't give that to you. And so it opens a question of, in a developed economy which has access to this data, we can actually begin to think about new composite indices, which very much rest within the family of data which can be calculated in equivalent monetizable terms, i.e. they can all be given a money value. If you think about human capital, we can say how much, if you take this qualification, extra will you earn over your lifetime. We can put a monetary value on the value of that qualification investment for individuals, and we can bring that together across society. And indeed, we have done that. That is the number I've got on the slide here. Equally, given that we now have a system of environmental and economic accounts, we are in a position where, alongside many other countries, we are making efforts to attempt to estimate a monetary value of these ecosystems, to allow you to then begin to group these together and develop a new composite indicator, which operates with a structure of consistent monetizable weights, what we might call objective sets of weights. So this isn't going to be an attempt, the second half of this presentation isn't going to be an attempt to produce a single index which draws together lots of data on happiness and regret and freedom and the value of democracy, more esoteric components, which some economists may view that you can find a way of producing monetizable estimates of that. I'm going to leave them to that field. In terms of having well-structured systematic data across these capital domains, I think we are in a position as a country to bring together existing data and ask ourselves the question, what happens if we add this data together? What does it tell us? And what can we learn from that without fundamentally straying very far from the way we might think about GDP? And this is quite important because I'm going to move on again to say, pretty much, if you want people to stop using one data source to which they are deeply devoted and have used for many years, I mean, I'm sure we all have that bit of data which we plug into our models or our that we routinely look at, which may have been perfect in the day, maybe a bit outdated now, but rather than rewriting the whole of your database and the whole of your model, you may wish to keep using it. In a world where GDP is strong and dominant, we do need to think about how we, what we need to deliver to produce a valid and successful competitor. And it is worth saying that GDP does some things very, very well. Firstly, it's definitive. If GDP goes up 0.1% as opposed to going down 3%, you can see a very clear and definitive direction of travel. And you don't need to have a huge amount of expertise in economics to see the difference between this number going up, staying the same, or going down. It also has other really attractive attributes. It is produced in a timely fashion around the world. We produce our data after about 35 days after the end of the period for the first quarterly estimate. We produce monthly estimates of GDP. We then compile these together into quarterly and then annual restatements of that data, which means that there's a steady flow of data that people can use, and then people can adapt as it changes to take account of more information. It's explainable. One of the really strong features of GDP is that if you want to know why you've grown 2%, you can break it down in different ways. You can see whether that was caused by the telecoms industry or the retail industry. You can see whether it was driven by household spending or business investment. You can see whether it was returned to the population in the terms of salary or in the terms of dividends or through taxes and subsidies. You can very much get a granular picture of what's happening. And you can also produce it for smaller and smaller geographies. So you can produce regional numbers, local authority numbers. If you wanted to attempt to do the GDP of your street, theoretically it's possible if the data was there. And finally, because this has been developed in incremental stages from 1948 onwards, and it's worth saying the initial 1948 document is a very slight document. It doesn't compare to their sort of 700-800 pages of close text that we see in the current version, and which no doubt will expand in the 2025 version. But people have spent a lot of time internationally to bring together the best perspective we can on how exactly to stitch this data together so it's internally consistent, and you don't have double counting, and you don't have omissions for those things which should be in scope. And these, ultimately, the blue quote in the middle, all economic variables of prices and volume are measures of welfare to some degree. So GDP is a measure of welfare, but it's also importantly true it's not a very accurate one because it's not a very complete one because of those points around human and natural capital that I've just talked about. These green arrows on the right dominate that blue problem, that conceptually this might not be a measure that really matches the concept that you're really excited about. But these attributes, being definitive, being timely, being explainable, being internally consistent, mean that people use it even though it's not the right measure for them, because, as I've said, it excludes key measures of the economy. It is gross, it is not net. And so if we destroy our capital, and we can think about natural capital or even running down machinery. If we run down all of the machinery in all of our factories and just keep taking the money out and live off, GDP won't recognize that. It will just see the consumption. It won't see the damage to the machines that now no longer as operable as they once were. GDP also is fundamental. In 1948, people thought in a very domestic, very national way, and said, the rules within the system of national accounts, we could talk about that all day, talk very much about ownership. Economic ownership is important. The things which a country owns goes into its GDP. So if the UK owns it, it goes in the UK GDP. If the French own it, it goes in the French GDP. But you do have increasingly the need for us to think about assets where ownership is really complex. Who owns the atmosphere? If the French hypothetically cause pollution to occur, which crosses the channel and comes into the UK, how should we think about that? Particularly, if we produce pollution and it crosses to other nations, how should we capture that in our data? Equally, things like moving into the technological side of the world. Many of you, David was referencing, that we're viewing this via the cloud. Now, whether that is happening via a cloud server farm in Dublin, in Berlin, or London, very possibly even the owner of those server farms won't know. They will have an algorithm in the background which is allocating data to optimize the totality of their system. So if halfway through there's a data spike which stops us being in Dublin and moves us to the London terminal, very possibly we definitely won't see, and very possibly the data owner won't see, the server farm owner won't see. But when we're trying to think about where David pays his cloud fees to, these questions of, for something which is essentially international and being managed on an international basis, where that flows into national numbers is hard for us to think about. And finally, the 2008 iteration of the system of national accounts doesn't sound that long ago, but it is an incredibly different world. It mentions the word digital 3 times. In every respect, it refers to digital cameras, a product which, these things have entirely superseded in the lifetime of the document. There's no mention of crypto assets. There's no mention of cloud service. There's not even any mention of broadband. Quite fundamental things to how we think about our economy are not there. So whilst we're trying to catch up in the current iteration, these are all reasons why new measures could potentially really help us. And we do need to tackle this because different users do have different needs. The national accounts community is very used to dealing with a pure economic GDP for use in finance ministries and central banks, but those who are seeking a wider perspective do need to be provided with data which can help them. Every agency has its own metrics, so there is these issues of confusion, and there is this need for a wider range of complements to GDP to help us to get to a data set which can help us make the right decisions. And as I've said, not every data issue needs to flow through the S&A. So what are we going to do? In the work we've been doing in the UK, we've been working on the basis of, let's take the methods from the national accounts and begin to draw in those assets, human and natural, which we know are currently excluded, but which we could include, and where we now have the data to include them, such that we get a wider perspective of economic life. So at the moment, GDP has these very strong methods that allow us to bring together very homogeneous goods like apples, very goods like cars, paid services like your gym membership, and free services like government and like healthcare. What we want to do is to integrate our stocks and our flows in such a way over a broader canvas that we're producing something which is consistent with GDP and which actually GDP is a component of, because we think that's really valuable in helping us to join the debate together, that we are in a position that, when people are using GDP, they can see how it relates to these wider data. I'm going to keep moving us forward. So putting this into some pictures so that you can see a bit more clearly what I mean. Let's imagine there's a scope of activity within the S&A which is used to define the flows which add up into GDP. And let's imagine that there's an equivalent boundary around the assets which are captured in the S&A. Essentially, what we're going to propose to do is we're going to make some extensions and we're going to make some conversions. So things like education and health spending, we're going to treat as investment into human capital, and we're going to add human capital assets into our landscape. We're going to recognize that when you and I go home at the end of the day and cook our own meal or wash the car or cut the grass, these are unpaid household activities, and because they're unpaid, they're not in the national accounts. But when one thinks about that megatrend, that UN identified megatrend about aging, with an increasing share of the population being retired, one needs to think about what they're doing and the contribution they're making, because grandparents doing childcare, for example, is a direct substitute for paid childcare. And so if you exclude it, you may, if you see a movement between these groups, if you see parents preferring one to the other, it could look like economic growth when it's just movement of activity across the boundary and the total amount of activity hasn't changed at all. We're going to do something technical about widening the scope of intangible assets. The S&A 08 began the journey of recognizing modern technology assets in its landscape, but there's still a journey to be completed there, and we attempt to show if we capture that spending and capitalize it, what's happening. And finally, we're going to attempt to better understand natural capitals and the natural capitals which currently lie outside the S&A. And as I say, we can do this because we have the basic fundamental building blocks. We have the national accounts, which gives us the economic activity. We have in the UK household satellite accounts, which give us the value of unpaid work. They are going to give us human activities, which deliver flows of benefits. We can add on to that the human capital satellite account, which tells us about the human capital flows. There are more difficult ownership considerations here. So a machine that's owned by IBM is a machine that's owned by IBM. The human capital, which is within the employees who work for IBM, is not owned by IBM. That would be known as slavery. IBM is a hypothetical example here, obviously. But thinking about how we capture this and identify it, there's a few accounting niceties that we need to deal with. And finally, we have the environmental satellite accounts. And I think probably this is one of the points that I do want to just stress for people, that this has been a journey that's been ongoing, I think, for a number of years, probably without many people noticing that where we often focus on GDP, the creation of these additional data resources by a number of NSIs, which demonstrates that this is possible, has often gone a bit under the radar. Now, I think it's fair to say that not every country in the world has a full set of these documents. If I had to put my hand on my heart, I'd say it's probably the big European countries and some of the big American countries. One or two others, New Zealand, for example, are also in that space. We're not going to be able to do this for big chunks of the developing world. And that often, I think, that is very, very important to bear in mind, that we're talking about, I think, something that does require data investment that many countries find very challenging. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't at least think about the methods. Not everyone in 1948 could deliver the national accounts. In fact, it was only the UK, the USA, and Palestine that originally laid out the first sets of data in the early years. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't conceptually understand the direction of travel, because if we each take small steps, sooner or later we'll all be able to finish the race. So let's talk about some numbers. So let's go on and talk about what we're going to show you. So we often describe the three measures that we have been working to identify how to produce on this spectrum. So what does this spectrum show you? So on the left-hand side is the very tightest economic set of measures that there are. So GDP minus says, let's strip out government, let's strip out charities, let's think just about the pure private sector. It's as narrow a focus on sort of market economic activity as you can get. And that's important to take that perspective, because it tells you that when you move to GDP, you'll often hear people say, oh, well, you shouldn't add all these free goods and other things into GDP. If you think about the free apps which are on your mobile phone, oh, no, we shouldn't include those because you're not paid for them. People don't really notice that over 20% of GDP is services delivered for free by the government. You've paid for them via your taxes, but you've paid for this via advertising revenue from advertisers who've used your used data to better target adverts to you. So when we're thinking about adding things into GDP, we kind of show the spectrum to say that this isn't an original idea. People have been adding things into GDP for many, many years. So gross inclusive income is the first metric we're going to talk about. I'm going to prefer talking about the net measures, because that allows us to solve that depreciation problem I talked about. But we're going to do a few technical things to adjust the public sector, and we're going to draw in value from outside the current asset and production boundary as per the box diagram that I've just shown you. With net inclusive income, we're going to try and strip out depreciation so that we can see how much we're gaining even after depletion of natural resources and these types of things. Democratic inclusive income. Ooh, what's this? This is a different term. Why am I throwing this in here? This is an effort to think about how we consider inequality and the distribution. And the basic problem is that economic, all the things I'm talking about are money weighted. So if a billionaire buys a £60 million yacht in a country of 60 million people, then the average basket of the average consumer will include £1 worth of super yacht. This isn't the lived experience of 99.9% of us. Very few of us have any connection to super yachts at all. And so what one needs to do is not to look at the average basket across the whole society when one's thinking about how you deflate or take account of price movements, these sorts of things. One needs to think about the basket of products purchased by the average family, or thinking about different percentile, different quartiles, for example. And so one of the things that ultimately we'd love to be able to do is to look at this in a distributional way and look at which sections of society are benefiting or not benefiting from these different flows. And then finally, as I say, that need for us to be humble, even if we produce better measures or wider measures of the economic side of well-being, that still means that there's an awful lot of things which I have my doubts can be captured in a single composite index. But our effort here is to produce a single composite index that we think can be competitive with GDP as it currently stands, and thus would sit as one of a number of items on a wider dashboard of well-being, of quality of life. So, where are we at the moment? The capital, because we're still having to do some conceptual work around the flows side. So thinking about investment, thinking about depreciation. So in effect, if one retires, you might say, oh, well, that's the point where someone leaves the labour market. But because we're thinking about their unpaid work at home, someone who has retired, who's age 70, who's still doing these things at home, you need to think about how to take that into account there. So we're a little bit short on that side. You know, we've not quite been able to get there, but very much in the early part of next year, we're hoping to be able to show people some additional data on that. Also, free digital products and how they support unpaid work. I don't know about you, I often use Google Maps on my phone to help me when I'm driving around. It helps me to avoid the queues and the traffic. That has made my unpaid work a lot more productive, a lot more efficient. And one can think about this in relation to communications. Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok, all of these sorts of things allow us to deliver thousands more messages every year than we did when we had to put a stamp on a letter. And so there is a need for us to capture that as well. And that also is coming. But that doesn't mean that what we've got doesn't already give us some really interesting pictures and messages. For those of you, I'm going to make the final set of slides available to David. He can share them however he likes. And for those of you who want to really sort of get into the technicals, this is giving you the sort of itemized list of the aspects of the bits of data which are going to go into, children walking through, of the composition of GII and NII. Right, so on to some results. And this is where it all gets a bit more interesting. So, about 15 years ago in the UK, it was identified that when one thinks about government and government-delivered systems and services, that the ways we measured them, looking at the number of children in school, looking at the number of operations which were undertaken, didn't account for quality. So it didn't account for the number of qualifications the children achieved. It didn't account for the number of people who survived the operation and saw improved health. And this is effectively like thinking about a paid service and not thinking about price change and not thinking about the cost of the price that people are willing to pay, because people will generally pay more for an operation which makes them better and less for one that doesn't. Now, Tony Atkinson, who is a leading UK economist, does a lot of work in this space, and we've been implementing this outside the national accounts for a number of years. And we are currently considering how we take this into the system, because whilst we were in the European Union, we complied with the European system of accounts, which didn't allow this. Whereas the international system of national accounts agreed by the UN does. And as one can see, this would potentially have a noticeable effect on the value and growth of the value of public services. And because of that, we felt it was important to reflect that within the wider picture. That's kind of an aside, but it's important to see, to explain all the components of the data as we produce it. So, just to try and put this into some relative scales, this is giving you a picture of net inclusive income in 2016 in current price terms, and you can sort of see the magnitudes here. So the market economy, so the value add 1.3 trillion. You add the government sector effectively, that gets you up to GDP at about 2 trillion. We're going to add a bit of intangible investment, as I've described. You don't see quality adjusted public services as I've just described them, because that's only a chain volume metric, a real concept, not a current price concept. I won't go into that in detail, but if you really want to know, I'm sure you can ask a question. Unpaid household production, you can see, is a really big component. And I think this is really important to understand, that the UK is at a really significant turning point in its economy. Possibly, you know, if one thinks about the COVID period, even without that, as this data shows, by 2016, the value of the output being produced in our households without money changing hands. So me cooking and cleaning for my family, me doing childcare, home produced transport services, home produced communication services, has reached a point where it's almost equivalent to all the activity undertaken in the private sector for cash, for pay. This is, an area that we're investigating, whether, we're trying to discern whether this is quite normal, but I have a feeling this is very possibly the first time since, the Industrial Revolution, or at least since the mass movement of female workers out of the household and into paid activity in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that this is a picture that we see in the UK. I think it's very much driven by an aging demographic and an increasing share of the population being retired and not in paid work, because they're still going to be doing all of these things. We're still going to capture it. But it's important for us to think about in terms of how we get our minds around what's happening in the UK economy today. So that gives you gross inclusive income of about 3.3 trillion. Then we take off the various forms of depreciation, gives a net number of about 2.7 trillion. So, in the sort of levels terms between GDP and net inclusive income, we've added about 0.7 trillion pounds. It's a big number, and well worth thinking about how we understand it. Now, on the left-hand side of this picture, in early versions of this, we to tie this back to national accounts concepts, we called it augmented net national disposable income, but it's a net inclusive income. So if we'd started this data in about 2009, we'd have looked at our new data, this grey line at the top of the left-hand diagram, looked at net national disposable income from the Blue Book, looked at GDP growth, looked at market sector GVA growth, and we'd have said, there's not much of a story here. We're probably wasting our time. Thankfully, in the UK, we can get back to 2005, and now that allows us to look through the 2007-8-9 great financial crash. And what you see is perhaps not that surprising. If you include unpaid work and people are laid off, they're going to do more of these things themselves. They're not going to buy meals in restaurants, they're going to cook for themselves. And so one would expect to see the downturn in 8-9 being dampened by this unpaid activity buoying the series back up again. What you might then expect is to see a sort of counter movement, that as paid employment takes off, people reduce their unpaid activity. Now, household production is the green bar, is on the right-hand side, we've taken that grey line and we've decomposed its drivers and the factors which are feeding into it. And within there, what you see is that people didn't stop doing unpaid work. As they came out of the great financial crisis, unpaid household activity remained strong and continued to grow, and grow noticeably stronger in a stronger fashion than the paid economy, which is sort of the blue and the orange bars nearest the origin. And indeed, if one is reliant on paid income during this period, one's had clearly a worse experience than if one is able to live off of other, and deliver for yourself through unpaid work. That story about labour market disconnection out of the 2008-9 financial crisis is very, very similar to the discussion that's happening now around COVID and around the increased levels of economic activity amongst those aged 50 or over in the UK economy who haven't returned to work following the COVID crisis. And it is suggested that when one puts it back, and we haven't been able to do the sort of fully detailed work yet, but if one puts this back and looks at that very much stronger capital number, those strong capital numbers I showed you right at the start, if society has more assets and can liberate some of those to live off of, they don't need to do paid work in the same way that maybe they did in the past. And I think the relationship between capital, salaries and unpaid work is one that we want to do a lot more work on. The other thing that those of you with sharp eyes might be seeing is that atmospheric degradation is a negative. Now, many people will look at this graph and go, aha, you've done something wrong here, because we know carbon emissions are falling and are falling really rather strongly. And indeed, we now publish carbon emissions data on a quarterly data alongside GDP, and this data has been falling. What we're doing here is putting the quantity of carbon being produced, which is falling, against a carbon price number, which is rapidly growing. And effectively what this series shows us is that that carbon price, which reflects the damage which is being caused to the atmosphere by the addition of one more ton of carbon, is growing, and is growing faster than the UK is currently reducing its emissions. So the net effect of the UK on the atmosphere is still a drag. Now, it's worth saying that that carbon number is reflective of a sort of international number, which reflects the global damage caused by carbon, which of course isn't all experienced in the UK, and the UK may well not be experiencing as much of that damage as other nations, but trying to capture this in terms of an average number, which can be used internationally, and indeed the System of National Accounts is thinking about how we try and capture this. What we've done is attempt to replicate the System of National Accounts proposed methodology here, which would show that the UK is still having a small downwards pull. Carbon sequestration, which is a very small bar actually on the very bottom of that teal bluey bar at the bottom, you can't even really see it, is because our peatland has been damaged over the years to the extent that it's now an emitter rather than a sequesterer of carbon. I'm hoping that's the right word, but effectively peatland normally, if it's in pristine condition, will absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. Because of damage in the UK to peatlands, it currently is a net emitter and is releasing carbon, and that's why you see that series there. Now, obviously, that really big green bar, and I'm going to tie up in just a second, is, all household activity is not the same. Grandparents taking the children to the theatre or the zoo or the park is a very different experience to a single young mum living in a small flat who can't afford childcare and has to remain at home and is experiencing fewer life chances and less of a positive experience from that potentially. That's one of the reasons that we increasingly want to look at this distributional aspect of this, and so not all of that green experience is going to be the same for all parts of society, and I think that's really important to remember. In exactly the same way that we have a debate about quality jobs, good quality jobs, and making sure that a large part of that blue and orange block, it represents quality work, we need to think about it the same way about the green. So that's got us to some conclusions, and so our conclusions are these new measures perfect? No, we still got to do quite a bit of work actually. Capturing human capital and thinking about how we incorporate that is going to require a fair bit of work, and thinking about then what that number means, because if you think about depletion of human capital, so let's imagine that an average working life is 40 years, so about 2.5% of the population retire every year. If your annual depletion of 2.5% or depreciation looks something in the region of 2.5% of 23 trillion pounds, that's a lot of money. And that's going to be, even relatively small movements in that number are going to have quite a big effect in that index that we're showing. So well worth us explaining and making sure we get that right. Natural capital. The UK has probably the richest set of environmental accounts in the world, but we haven't finished. There's more we need to do. Marine ecosystems, particularly, an area that we are doing more work on at the moment. So the big question, will these new measures, and particularly will that central framework, which I was describing, replace GDP? I think no. And I think no, because there will be a place for GDP in terms of economic decision making. The problem we've got, and the problem we've had over the last 20, 30 years, is we're trying to use one number for very different activities and for very different purposes. It's kind of like a range of different customers coming into my hardware shop, and irrespective of what job they're trying to perform, I sell them a screwdriver because I'm only making screwdrivers. The problem is we still need a screwdriver, but we also need to be able to produce the drill and the pair of pliers and the hammer and a range of data which allows people to make the right choices. And very much the direction of travel that I think the wider framework of sustainable inclusive well-being will deliver is one that I see that as being, I think, vital. That set of variables. That doesn't mean that, you know, an inclusive income, I think, is one of those variables, because it does allow you to contextualize a range of data that's currently produced alongside GDP. We produced a work plan. You can find it on our webpage, which explains how we're going to attempt to update this data. The sharp eyes amongst you will have seen that our data runs up to 2017. Early next year, we're hoping to bring it up to date, relatively up to date, by getting up to 2020, and then to follow as 21, 22 as fast as we can. We also want to explore if we can get to quarterly data. And I think that takes me to the end of the slides. So David, I'm going to pause there and turn back to you.
Many thanks, Richard. You've given us a lot to think about. There are 3 questions that have popped in already, and I encourage the audience to take time to think of which questions you would like to ask. Preferably a short question, but I'll start off, Richard. Are there examples in which there are political decisions that have been taken based on GDP considerations where they would have taken a different decision if they had included the wider measures of net inclusive income, your NII or the DII? Would there have been a difference to some of these decisions?
I think, you know, very much that's why we're designing it. And I think particularly, you know, coming straight off the back of COP27, the fundamental question of the trade-offs, you know, one of the reasons I think policymakers find it very, very difficult in and around this debate is because it is, if you don't have a number where you are able to capture both sides of the trade-off between the economy and the environment, you're asking people to actually do something which is cognitively very difficult. They're trying to splice together 2 very different data domains to conceptualize how one affects the other and vice versa, and any second order effects, and then to, off the back of all of the assumptions they're having to make in their minds about how to do that, an optimal series of decisions. And very much that's one of the key drivers of why we've looked to develop this, because by putting the data together so that we can see the changes on both sides in one index, you can see immediately the trade-offs, and indeed whether you've got any win-wins. You know, that really is what you're hoping to achieve. You know, so a policy like developing wind farms or extending wind farms allow you to increase your productive capital, allow you to increase your measure of economic activity, but also reduces your carbon. And within this framework, you'd see both sides of that impacting flowing through into one set of data. So I very much hope so. That's what we're trying to achieve.
There are some questions about the atmospheric degradation. One comment from Terry Raby in the questions is that the atmospheric degradation is very small, where whilst expenditure on decarb is apparently high. Should we conclude from your figures that we should be doing less on decarbonisation, Or might we instead conclude that the estimates for the damage of on the atmosphere is somehow not being properly captured? It's only looking at the present danger and not sufficiently accounting for future dangers in present estimates.
Yeah, very, very good question. This is one that whenever I take this around government or to other users, always gets jumped upon, and it's a very, very important point, because at the heart of what we're doing is we're trying to bring together comparable data. Now, within the framework that we've got, we use effectively, just standing back for a second, the way to think about value is driven by the quantity and the price that you put onto each unit of quantity that you produce. And that's the sort of concept that we're applying beyond the economic part here. Now, the question of what price becomes really, really important. GDP is generated using market prices, and the environmental economic accounts are also generated using either market prices where they exist or market equivalent prices where they're being estimated. But what we all know is that by definition, a market price doesn't capture the cost of the externality. So the box of cigarettes doesn't cover the cost of the healthcare in hospitals, which lung cancer and various illnesses cost society. And it's exactly the same on the environment. And what we're effectively saying in this work is that the sort of market price or market equivalent price, which is currently being used around carbon, is low compared to what one might expect if one is thinking about a fully loaded price, including the cost of the externalities, including the cost of the damage of global warming, of climate change, these types of things. Now, Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge has been thinking about this very intensively and has been proposing methods of how we could attempt to incorporate these price differences, these costs, these externalities. And one of the things we would love to do is to bring that into the scope of this work. We started with what we've got market prices. That's how the accounts are produced. So we want to get that data used, and that's what we've put together. As I said, that doesn't mean it's perfect. And if we could get better measures for the environment, I think that would be of the impact of environmental change, that would be hugely helpful. I think the other thing to just mention there is that obviously we anticipate step changes in price. So the whole point of the sort of discussions about 1.5% at COP are about the fact that you reach these turning points in the environment that you may not be able to then recover back from. You know, you reach these points which are irreversible, I suppose is the word I'm looking for, and that again needs to be captured in that cost of that externality, which isn't currently captured in the market price. And indeed, if it was, then we would see very different behaviours, one would imagine.
Thanks. I'm going to take the questions which have got the most thumbs up votes in the Q&A. I doubt we're going to get through all of them, so please help me, audience, by casting your votes there. There are a couple of questions on measures of well-being, so I'll take them together. Ted Gordon just asks simply, do you think that there will be a measure of well-being at some time in the future which commands significant respect and attention? And I'll parallelize that question with one from PNJ, who wonders whether the measurement of well-being should be completely decoupled from this kind of economic considerations, and rather than get economists involved in determining measurements of well-being, maybe you need totally different discipline, maybe still statistical measures, but different frameworks.
Yeah. So I've a lot of sympathy with that second view. I mean, the issue with beyond GDP is that the operative word is the first word. You're going beyond GDP, you're going beyond an economics environment, and you do need to be bringing in social researchers, you need to be bringing in sociologists, you need to be bringing in anthropologists, you need to be bringing all right demographers, population expert. We need, it's impossible from one viewpoint to understand the multidimensional form that is well-being. You absolutely have to have different perspectives. You have to absolutely bring in a very wide range of domains. I think philosophy very possibly has quite an important role to play here. Many, they've been thinking about this for hundreds of years, and I don't think yet we've claimed to have a complete answer. So I would agree. I don't think you want to completely decouple the economic from that perspective, but it needs to be an appropriately sized piece of the pie. It definitely isn't dominant, but it is important. Material well-being, our homes, the goods that we can have within them, are important aspects of our well-being. But I for one don't think that I can ever find a way of weighting my computer, my car, my cat against love, against regret, against the laughter of a child. This is an impossible calculation. And that's why in terms of the first part of your question, I don't think it'll ever be likely that we can achieve a single measure of well-being. I do believe we can achieve sensible dashboards that bring together multiple aspects of data which give you well-being, and I think GII, NII could be an important contributor of a wider view of the economic rather than just GDP within that landscape. But it's I think we're making the raisins that go into a fruitcake. We're not making the fruitcake. That's probably the analogy that I would use.
So you expect there might be some progress towards a more widely agreed measure of well-being, but you don't expect a single parameter. You expect a whole variety of possible measures which different people will weigh up in their own different ways.
Yes, and I think that very much is why when I was talking at the front about the well-being framework, it is a framework within which to think about well-being. And when we think about domestic dashboards, there's various measures that the UK doesn't contain on its dashboard, which are key parts of the SDGs. So child literacy, in the UK, we have very, very high rates of child literacy. It wouldn't make much sense to use one of a limited number of slots on a dashboard for something that is 99.9% or whatever and remains 99.9%. You want to see the things where you actually have traction and where changing a factor significantly would have some impact. If you closed all of the child literacy gap, I'm not saying that that's not important, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying compared to some parts of the global south, that aspect would have far more dominance in their dashboard than it would in parts of the global north. And so I think it is important to allow different countries to develop tailored approaches to these dashboards that reflect their particular needs, their particular conditions, their particular cultures. Otherwise, they're not going to recognize them. You can't impose these things from the center. And to get them to be used, I think people do need that degree of ownership, which indeed I think is ownership of your ability to drive your own decisions. I think is a key part of that well-being landscape in and of itself.
I think you're convincing me that this is a more complicated set of problems than I might have naively hoped was the case. I was sort of hoping that your Office of National Statistics, in discussion with other groups around the world, was on the point of developing something that could become a universally accepted measure of welfare. But what I'm hearing is that not only is that a problem, there are lots of problems with agreeing measurements on the well-being of the environment and indeed agreeing measurements on the problem of the economy. So it's a big problem. Are you making progress on that big problem by cooperating with people in different statistical units around the world? You mentioned at the beginning, I think, partnerships in Canada, Netherlands, and the US, amongst other places. Are they bringing different insights into this? Are you able to divide and conquer on this, or are you all equally fazed by the magnitude of the issues ahead?
I think what we all see is, if I go back to the start of the talk, sort of the variety of social demographic measures, there was an attempt in the 1960s to try and draw up a for the social side, which ultimately failed because not enough, many countries didn't have the data sources, they didn't have the information available. There are UN reports with all of the maths and all of the beautifully laid out matrices. If you've got the right data, you can just pour it on in and it would all populate. But for vast parts of the world, even up into the 80s and 90s, funding statistics can often seem a luxury. And even in the developed world, many statistics institutes have seen a sort of funding roller coaster, times of plenty and then times of less. I think what we're in now is a world where we can see that increasingly countries do have access to data, and whether that is through your traditional methods of surveys and these sorts of things, or new technologies and new data sources which are becoming available. So we, during the pandemic, we're producing a range of faster indicators using all sorts of data that we were able to harvest from government and beyond about the flow of traffic, about ships docking in ports, around the health data, particularly. You think about the weekly COVID reports that you saw on the media at the time. All of that was stood up with incredible speed because actually systems and capability to harness and to tackle data have now massively improved. And I think that's a really key driver in why around the world, as you've just described, all sorts of bodies are looking at these documents and these reports that were written in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, describing, in a perfect world, how we'd do this, and saying, well, actually, is this the opportunity? Is the time right? Is collecting this data now materially cheaper? One example of that I'll briefly flag is some of you may in the past have completed a time use survey. So this is where you get a thick paper document to fill out how you spend each hour of each day over a week. And this was incredibly costly to collect. The ONS used to collect this every 5 years, used to cost us in the region of £500,000, and was a really vital, it's a really valuable piece of information. You can really get all sorts of information from it around unpaid work and other aspects. We've worked with a web developer over the last few years. The last time use survey we did was done, via one of these, where you load up an app. You could update whether you're doing one activity or many activities. If you're looking at the internet, it would say you were looking at the internet. If you're playing an online game, it would say you were playing an online game. It wouldn't tell us which online game or what you were looking at on the internet, but that's a level of detail we don't require. And obviously we have, ethics committees that look at exactly how we structure these sorts of things. But we're able to now deliver that on a 6-monthly rolling basis. We have data on a 6-monthly basis from before COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID to see how people and the way they're living their lives have changed. And the costs of that are nowhere near the sort of £500,000 we're spending every 5 years. We're talking tens of thousands now. We've developed the app and paid for that to actually run each increment of the survey, which means it's cheaper, it's faster, it's better quality data. that's the opportunity that I think across the statistics community we're looking at the landscape and going, okay, how do we push on and do these things that we haven't been able to do in the past, but which we might now be able to achieve.
Can I feed in one more question about measuring health?
Yes.
I mean, I was personally grateful and impressed by some of the statistics from the Office of National Statistics on things like excess deaths, and also going back a little bit further, expected health spans. This is pre-COVID, and the measurement not just of how long people might expect to live based on actual total life, but how long people could expect to say that they were healthy and vigorous. I liked all that. But I see the highest ranked question is by David Dewhurst, who is just saying, isn't it going to be really hard to measure health implications properly? He points to the example of strong debate about the pros and cons of high sugar and fast carb diets. You can benefit children by giving them growth hormones, but you generate risks of diabetes later in life. And there are all kinds of different ideas and models of the impacts of diets. Can you really hope to square all that in some of the statistics you're gathering?
This is, again, that's an excellent question. And the great challenge around health is it's not just healthcare that determines the state of health that you achieve. Your genes, your environment, your diet, whether you decide to go to the gym or not, as well as your doctor, your GP, your local hospital, these all play a really significant part. And that probably is one of the most significant challenges that Tony Atkinson identified in his study, and that we've been working with ever since, which is if I just decide to, I don't smoke, but if I just decide to stop smoking today, that is likely to have more impact on my health in total over my my future lifespan than going to visit the doctor tomorrow to get a tablet for something. And so when we measure the quality of health, which is what we try and capture in that slide that I showed you, and I could talk about that literally for another hour and a half, that area, we look at how far we can attribute improvements in health to health activities. So that doesn't mean that we're going to claim all of the benefits. We recognize that they need to be spread around various drivers of health, but we do try and identify where health activity in the health service has improved health outcomes. So we do that by looking at quality adjusted life years. We also stand back a little bit and say, look, not everything health does is just driven around the health output. So sort of, if you go to the hospital, that to a degree, there's a bed and breakfast experience there as well. You're in a form of accommodation. And so we do ask people their experiences within the health service and whether they feel the health service has treated them with respect, has treated them safely, as well as the longer term health benefits. So probably it's a complicated question, it's a complicated answer. We try very hard to make sure we don't double count and we don't overclaim the benefits of the health system. But we are also, there are parallel products that we're producing. We now produce a health index, which looks just at sort of health experience of the UK. And I would positively encourage people to look at that if that's an area that they're interested in. But yes, that's a very good question.
What can people look at? I had one question before this event from somebody who says he wished he could access your underlying data because there must be lots of fascinating data in there which maybe isn't made explicit in through your web services. Is that something that maybe he's misunderstood? Maybe everything is accessible, or maybe you've got reasons for keeping more tight control over it?
Oh, no. So We've published 2 research papers via the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence webpage, which you can find at www.escoe.ac.uk. Look under publications, search for Hayes, and you'll inevitably find them. And the second paper is an empirics paper. It takes you through all of the data that we use. There's big tables in there of the data that we use. For those of you who don't know the ONS's website really well, and I don't blame you if you don't, every type of data, every row of data has a 4-digit code called a CDID. And in the report, for every bit of data that we use, we identify the CDID, the specific identifier number for the series that you want. So you can go, you use our search function, you search for the CDID code, and you'll be able to get to the source data. There is some data that we derive to fully populate the system, and the annexes in that paper describe how we've done that. But if you want to talk to me, I'm more than happy for people to get in contact. We make all of our data available and transparent, unless it's disclosive, and there's nothing in here which is disclosive. So if you are looking for some of the components, very much that's our business. That's what we're here for.
Final, very quick question, and hopefully there'll be a quick answer. I'm taking some comments from the YouTube live stream, and Aaron Ray there says he expected to hear more coverage of various topics, and I think your answer is going to be, well, if you'd gone on longer, you would have covered them. I'll just list them quickly. Regional gross, regional products, innovation accounting, sustainable growth, capital flows to the fastest businesses by industry, technology capital density, investment by sector. Sorry, I'm not making a very good job of reading all this out, but I'm fairly sure that you've got a whole host of different things that you consider in part of the model that you are building. And maybe the slides that you provide, in which I will make available on the London Futurist site, will go some way to filling in some of the things you didn't have time to cover.
Yeah. They're all really important angles, and I think this is a problem that the national accounts integrates vast quantities of data, and so we could have looked at this from any one of a number of angles. I think innovation, though I talked about intangible capital, and that is I think key to our understanding of innovation. How the UK is again one of these turning points in the way we think about our economy. When we capture a fuller set of intangible assets that we don't currently include in the national accounts as capital, we currently invest more today in these intangible assets than we invest in machinery and buildings and cars and vans and all these sorts of things. Now, they do have shorter asset lives, so they feature far less in the stock because they erode away more rapidly, as you'd expect. Software doesn't last as long as a building, in effect. But in investment terms, innovation is really, really important, and so we think that is an angle we've picked up. Sustainable growth, absolutely front and center, and by trying to think about the wider set of capitals, ultimately, as Partha Dasgupta in his recent review for Treasury flagged, that you've got to be thinking across these capital domains and understand the trade-offs between them. Because if you don't understand your impact on the economy, if you don't fully account for that, then you are not going to be sustainable in the long term. I think that's absolutely right. Capital flow, regional numbers. I'd love to do regional numbers. We are, the UK very much is at the front of the pack globally, and to be able to produce some of these numbers at a national level. Many of them aren't available yet on a regional or a subnational basis. It's the dream, don't get me wrong, and given enough time and enough funding, I could make it happen. But there is always that question of prioritization, as with any area of government. And we're trying to make sure we're making the best use of the data we've got, and in effect making the case for future investment, of showing the value that this data could provide. And I think you've got to view us in that pilot stage of trying to make that case. And I think that's very important. Capital flows and how capital decisions take account of this. I think, again, you know, when you think about the financial accounts side of the national accounts, the numbers there are really, really big. I mean, the numbers there are enormous, and even marginal improvements to decision making there in relation to some of these issues can potentially deliver real benefits. So I think, you know, yes, we could have talked about all of those for very much longer. I think
well, we should
right,
wind
David.
up. We've kept you longer than normal. It's such a fascinating subject. I'll just finish with a couple of quotes from the chat. From David Dewhurst, he says he's heartened and impressed by the ONS progress so far. And from Anik Sarkar, amazing. Thanks, Richard. He has learnt a lot. And there's more where that came from. So indeed, I have learned a lot, and I see that some of the problems are chunkier and more complex than I would have wished them, or maybe hoped they would be. But, you know, there's no point us being naively optimistic. We need to see the full lie of the land before we can bring resources to properly make progress. So I'm going to wind down the formal part of this event. I expect most people will head off, but I will keep the Zoom open, and in about 5 or 7 minutes, whoever's still here, I'll be happy to chat away for another half an hour or so, informally, picking up some of the pieces that we couldn't address. But let me give you a warm, heartfelt thanks, Richard, for sharing all this information, opening our eyes as to a very important piece of work that's going on in the UK, but also worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much.